Ever get stuck with like one of those fancy coffee machines? You know, the ones where you're then forced to buy their overpriced pods?
Yeah, I've been there.
Total pain. Well, that's a tiny taste of vendor lock-in, my friends.
Ouch.
And today, we're taking that feeling to the tech world. Specifically, we're diving into software and cloud computing, where the stakes, well, they're way higher than a caffeine fix.
Definitely higher.
We're going deep on a blog post from OpenCoda today.
Good piece.
Yeah, it's called What is Vendor Lock-in and How to Avoid It. And it's all about, seeing this whole thing from a developer's perspective.
Yeah, and it's a pretty important perspective considering OpenCoda found that something like 67% of executives are actively trying to avoid this lock-in trap.
67%. So the other 33% are just like playing with fire.
Maybe. Or maybe they just haven't quite figured out how to avoid it yet.
Okay, true. But before we go there, let's take it back to basics for a sec. What exactly is vendor lock-in when we're talking about like software and cloud services?
So imagine you're a company, right? And you've gone all in on some vendor's platform. You're totally reliant on their technology, their systems, their pricing, everything. Switching to a different vendor, well, it would be almost impossible. Technically a nightmare and crazy expensive. And that, my friend, is vendor lock-in in a nutshell. Being stuck with one provider, even if you've got good reason to leave.
So it's not even just about the cost of switching. It's the whole being trapped thing. Like you can't get out even if you wanted to.
Exactly. It's the dependence that's scary, especially these days with how fast technology changes. What might seem super convenient right now might be what's holding you back in a year.
That's the real fear, right? And a great point, I think, for our listeners to keep in mind. But let's get into those consequences, because I know some people listening might be thinking, well, if it works, right? So what are some of the real life risks of being stuck with just one vendor?
One of the biggest ones OpenCoda talks about is price. That fear that you're at the mercy of your provider's, shall we say, flexible pricing.
Yeah, flexible is a nice way to put it.
Right. So imagine this. You're locked into a contract and suddenly your business is taking off. You need to scale up, but whoa, those costs.
Talk about growing pains. Yikes. And I'm guessing price hikes aren't the only worry when it comes to this whole being locked in thing.
Oh, not even close. Imagine your golden provider. They have a massive outage. Everything goes down. Your customers are freaking out. And there you are, totally helpless, just waiting for them to fix it.
Oh man, talk about a nightmare. It's like putting all your eggs in one very fragile basket.
That's a good way to put it. And don't even get me started on what it does to innovation. Imagine being stuck with some vendor who's gotten comfortable while everyone else is moving on to bigger and better things.
Yeah, it's like being stuck in slow motion while the rest of the world speeds up. Okay, we've definitely established that vendor lock-in is something you want to avoid. But before everyone spirals, the good news is that OpenCoda also talks about how to escape this trap, right?
Oh, yeah, they do. And they're big on choosing open source platforms whenever possible. It's like they say, the key to staying independent and adaptable.
Okay, so I think we need to break down open source for a second, because I know not everyone listening is a tech whiz. What does that even mean?
Simply put, open source just means that you can actually see and work with the code behind the software. Like you've got the actual recipe instead of some pre-made dish.
So more control. Got it. And I'm going to take a wild guess here and say that OpenCoda probably has something to do with this whole open source approach.
You know it. In fact, they talk about how a lot of these low-code platforms, those tools that are supposed to make building apps easier,
Yeah, I've heard of them.
well, they can actually make this whole vendor lock-in problem even worse.
Wait, really? How does that even happen?
So yeah, they might make building apps faster and simpler upfront, but they often end up locking you into using their system, their pricing, their limitations, the whole shebang. It's like a classic case of, taking a shortcut that ends up being the long way around.
So it's all about really being careful, even when something seems super easy and convenient. Choosing those tools and platforms that, empower you instead of limiting you.
100%. You got it. And that's where OpenCoda comes in. They're all about offering an alternative, a way to build and manage applications where you're not stuck with just one company's tech.
And this is where things get really interesting. We're going to dig into exactly how OpenCoda is tackling all this, but first, a quick break. All right, so we're back and ready to jump into how OpenCoda is shaking things up with this whole open source approach.
Yeah, they're all about giving developers a more, I guess you could say, transparent and flexible way to build their software.
Transparency and flexibility, those are definitely buzzwords these days. But I think for people who aren't, living and breathing code, it might be helpful to like paint a picture. How does this actually play out when we're trying to avoid getting locked in with a vendor?
So think of it this way. With OpenCoda, you're not just handed a finished product where you don't even know what's in it. You're given all the tools and ingredients so you can create something that's actually right for what you need.
Okay, so it's all about customization. You're not stuck with whatever the vendor decided was best for everyone. Makes sense.
Right. It's about having more control over your technology stack.
Okay, technology stack. There's another one for the glossary. Can we break that down for a sec?
Sure, it's basically just all of the different technologies that make your software or application actually work.
So like the DNA of your software.
Exactly. And with OpenCoda, you get to choose what goes into that DNA. You're not stuck with one provider's idea of what works.
That is super interesting. But I'm sure some folks listening are thinking, well, that's great, but what about companies that are already, locked into some agreement? Like, is there any way out once you're already there?
Totally. It might take some work, but it's definitely possible to get out of those situations. In fact, OpenCoda actually gives some tips on how to do that, how to regain control.
Okay, so spill the beans.
Yeah.
What can people start doing, like today, to get out of those vendor handcuffs?
One of the biggest things is making sure your data is portable from the very beginning. That way, if you need to switch providers, it's not a nightmare.
Data is king, right? Being able to take it with you is huge.
Absolutely. And when you're looking at different vendors, don't be afraid to ask the hard questions right away. What happens if we need to move our data? What are the fees? Are there any gotchas hiding in the contract?
Basically, go into those conversations with your eyes wide open. I like it.
That's it. And don't just think about what's right in front of you. Think about the long game,
Okay.
How flexible is this solution? Will it still work for you in a year or two?
It's like future-proofing your business, at least when it comes to tech.
Exactly. And that's another place where OpenCoda shines because they're all about open standards and making sure things work well together.
So it's like they're speaking a universal tech language, so you're not limited to just one device or platform.
Perfect analogy. It's about choosing solutions that give you the freedom to move and change as technology changes around you.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've talked about why getting locked in with a vendor is risky, why open source solutions are so great, and, how to actually avoid falling into those traps in the first place. But before we wrap up, I kind of want to switch gears for a minute and focus on OpenCoda a bit more. I mean, they're clearly passionate about this whole open source thing, but what does that look like day to day? How do they actually put these ideas into action? Let's explore that a little bit more right after this quick break. So we're back, and I'm really curious to dig into this whole OpenCoda thing a bit more. Like, we've talked about how they're all about open source, but what does that actually look like in the real world?
Well, the cool thing about OpenCoda is that they actually walk the walk. They don't just talk about open source, they build their software that way.
So when they say open source, they mean they literally make their code available for anyone to use.
Exactly. And not just to use, but to modify and even share, too.
Wow, that's pretty different from how most tech companies operate, right?
Yeah, it's a completely different philosophy. It means that with OpenCoda, developers aren't just like passive users. They can actually be active participants in shaping the technology.
So it's more of a community effort.
Exactly. And that has some pretty big implications, especially when it comes to, avoiding that vendor lock-in we talked about.
Oh, right. How so?
Well, because when you're working with open source software, you're not at the mercy of one company's decisions. Like, if OpenCoda were to ever, disappear or change their strategy completely, the community could, theoretically, keep things going.
That's incredible. That level of control and independence is almost unheard of in the tech world.
It really is. And it's not just about the code itself either. OpenCoda is also big on fostering a real sense of community around their products. They've got great documentation, really responsive support, and they're always encouraging collaboration.
So it's like a built-in support system for developers.
Yeah.
They're not just getting a piece of software, they're joining a network of people who can help them along the way.
That's a great way to put it. They're not just selling a product, they're building an ecosystem. And that makes a huge difference, especially for developers who are new to open source and might need a little extra guidance.
This has been so insightful. We've covered a ton of ground today. We talked about how risky vendor lock-in can be, why open source solutions are so powerful, and some practical tips to help people navigate this whole landscape. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Just that knowledge is power. The more you know about these things, the better equipped you'll be to make smart decisions, whether you're a seasoned developer or just starting out.
Love that. All right, everyone, that's a wrap on vendor lock-in. Big thanks to our expert for breaking it all down for us. And for our listeners, remember, whether you're knee-deep in code or just trying to stay ahead of the curve, Understanding this stuff is key to building a tech strategy that's built to last. Until next time, stay curious and keep coding.